Half an hour had passed when the damaged transfer valve finally came back to life, allowing precious fuel to flow once more to the waiting engines. The bomb bay doors, frozen solid during high-altitude flight, had mercifully thawed as the aircraft descended through warmer air. With heartfelt gratitude and firm handshakes all around, the Army airmen politely declined the Marines' chorus of invitations to enjoy an evening on beautiful Iwo Jima. They climbed aboard their aircraft with purpose. It was mid-afternoon, and they were determined to reach Saipan before darkness fell. Malo fired up the engines and guided the bomber down the runway. Dynamite began her journey slowly, deliberately, before gathering speed with volcanic dust swirling in her wake like a departing ghost. Japanese anti-aircraft guns erupted as the superfortress lifted into the sky, banking sharply rightward before vanishing into the protective embrace of cloud cover. Dynamite would return to Iwo on April 12th, severely damaged from a daring low-level firebombing mission over Tokyo. Quick repairs proved impossible, and Sergeant Robert W. Brackett remained behind with the wounded aircraft, waiting for major restoration work. Marlowe, Mockler, Eschman, Cox, and their fellow crew members were transported back to the Marianas and reassigned to other B-29s. Within 6 weeks, tragedy claimed them all, some shot down in flames over Honshu Island, others perishing in a fiery takeoff disaster on Tinian. Brackett survived the war, while Dynamite met her end in an Arizona aircraft graveyard. Bob Sherrod captured the paradox perfectly when he wrote that, to the Marines, Iwo appeared as the most forsaken place on Earth, yet B-29 pilots who made emergency landings there called it the most beautiful sight in the world. One crew flew 11 missions against Japan in 3 months following the battle's conclusion, finding sanctuary on Iwo 5 times. Their commander would say, "Whenever I touch down on this island, I thank God and the Marines who fought for it." During the early summer of 1945, when the superfortress offensive against Japan reached its zenith, an average of 20 bombers made emergency landings daily on Motoyama No. 1. Within a week of Dynamite's quick visit, the airstrip was handling a dawn-to-dusk stream of medical evacuat. While most casualties still travelled to the Marianas aboard the hospital ships Samaritan or Solace, air evacuation proved to be what Valentine Hollingsworth called a godsend and a miracle. Hollingsworth, a strapping second lieutenant from York, Maine, serving as a frontline artillery observer, had been struck twice by sniper fire that shattered his left leg. Within minutes, a jeep ambulance rushed him to the 3rd Division Hospital for emergency surgery, plasma, and morphine. An hour later, he was airborne to Guam. 5 hours after being cut down near Motoyama village, he was recovering in a Navy hospital nearly 700 miles from the battlefield. The survival prospects for the wounded had improved dramatically since the early fighting. Commander Clarence A. Keller piloted the first hospital plane to land on Iwo, bringing in his twin-engine Douglas transport, Peg Oh My Heart, shortly after dawn on March 3rd. He was nervous about setting down among the bulldozers and trucks scraping and patching the runway, struggling to see through the dust clouds they churned up. The landing jolted his precious cargo drugs, plasma, a ton of mail, a doctor, a corpsman, and 1 civilian passenger. A communications jeep, sporting a windsock on a pole wired to its rear bumper, guided the plane to shelter in a revetment below a cliff at Motoyama No. 1's northern end, where Keller shut down the motors near the 3rd Division Hospital. Marines stood slack-jawed when they saw who jumped first from the plane: Barbara Finch, a correspondent for Reuters, the British news service. Somehow, she had talked her way into a bucket seat among the medical supplies. She wore a nurse's khaki uniform of slacks and blouse, a petite blonde and aggressive, smooth-talking, a competent Australian who had chronicled marine battles since the early South Pacific campaigns alongside her husband Percy, who would later co-author Howlin' Mad, Smith's autobiography. Corporal Joe Purcell, a leatherneck correspondent from Boston and longtime friend of the Finches, couldn't decide whether to embrace Barbara or scold her for being on Iwo while Japanese shells continued their regular visits to the airstrip. "What in heaven's name are you doing here?" he shouted just as mortar fire began peppering the area. They ducked through tent flaps where casualties awaited evacuation. An unappreciative surgeon unceremoniously shoved them outside into a sandbagged foxhole. "Woman, get down on your face and stay there," he ordered. "And you, Corporal, make certain she does." The doctor had enough problems without worrying about a female civilian who could become a casualty herself. 30 minutes later, 12 Marine casualties were strapped into the plane's litters, and Peg Oh My Heart was airborne with its unexpected passenger, heading for the Marianas. When Admiral Nimitz learned of this episode back on Guam, Navy public relations officers who had approved Miss Finch's adventure received a dressing down in no uncertain terms, a rare display of anger from the usually composed Admiral. Days later, he had nearly forgotten the matter, though he remained concerned that other women were making regular flying trips to the battleground. Most were Navy nurses, but one was Dickie Chappelle, a photographer and writer on assignment from the Red Cross to document the use of whole blood in treating casualties. On Iwo, she began a mutual love affair with the Marines that would endure until her death in Vietnam. She triggered a landmine while covering that war in 1965, becoming the only American woman correspondent ever to die in battle. Ensign Jane Kendley of Oberlin, Ohio, was the first of approximately 20 Navy flight nurses who made the 1,500-mile round trips between the Marianas and Iwo. Another was Lieutenant Dorothy Barrows from Portland, Oregon. One seriously wounded Marine remembered her as a slender, charming girl in GI pants and shirt, hair wrapped in a red bandana, who moved constantly among stretchers hung 4 deep from ceiling to deck in webbed slings along the plane's starboard side. She was always bringing water, fruit juice, sleep shots, and a smile with cheerful words. She did much to change minds about women being in combat zones. Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm S. Mackay flew 7 supply missions, beginning hours after Peg Oh My Heart's inaugural landing. His massive Curtiss Commando was one of 15 from Marine Transport Squadron 592 assigned to the airlift. On his first approach, he requested landing instructions 5 miles from touchdown and was advised to come in downwind. When he asked why not an upwind approach, ground control gave him a no-nonsense reply. "Better not try it. That's over the front. The Japanese will shoot you." Mackay touched down with the wind at his tail, roared past the flight line of damaged aircraft and a disabled Navy fighter bomber, and swung around a sandbagged revetment at the runway's northern end. He gunned the engines, kicking up a dust cloud while taxiing at high speed to the strip's southern edge, where Marines immediately began unloading priority cargo. One wounded Marine told the pilot as his litter was lifted aboard that it wasn't safe anywhere on this island, that the Japanese had artillery a couple of miles north, and they had dropped 3 rounds down here just before he landed. 20 minutes later, the plane lifted off and disappeared into clouds. Mackay told his co-pilot it was the worst-looking island he'd ever seen, an observation made with authority, as months earlier, Mackay's transport had been first to land on Peleliu while fighting still raged there. From March 3rd to March 26th, an average of 124 casualties were airlifted daily from Iwo. In total, 2,449 wounded were flown to the Marianas without a single death in flight. 2 hospital planes were hit by anti-aircraft fire while taking off, but both returned safely to Motoyama, No. 1, and the wounded were evacuated on other aircraft. A 3rd Division sergeant who had lost both legs in the push beyond Motoyama village said that leaving Iwo by air was first class all the way. No one will ever know precisely when the 4th Division's battle for the meat grinder began losing its fury, but it was sometime between dawn and dusk of D+13, the 8th day of combat in that sector. When the 23rd and 24th Regiments began their attack at 7:30 in the morning, nothing indicated the worst might be ending. Only minor gains were made in the morning, as attack battalions moved against heavy resistance still coming from Turkey Knob, the amphitheatre, and Minami village. But with Hill 382 now firmly in Marine hands, patrols pushed cautiously ahead from its rugged eastern slopes toward the coast, where terrain would no longer be such a strong ally to the Japanese. Every yard of advance continued extracting its toll. Jim Lucas wrote that the battle surging back and forth over the meat grinder's rocky crags and cliffs, in and out of the labyrinth of caves, in the chambers of hidden gun emplacements, and in the bowels of buried tanks, cost as much as any single engagement on Iwo Jima. After VJ Day, Lucas would become a Pulitzer Prize correspondent for the Scripps Howard newspaper chain, covering other wars from Korea's frozen hills to the Middle East's deserts and Vietnam's rice paddies and jungles. He died in 1973 from complications of elephantiasis, a tropical disease that first struck him as a Marine sergeant in the Solomon Islands in 1942. Flamethrower tanks and rocket-launching trucks supported the attack wherever possible. but many Japanese positions were too well hidden to be discovered until Marine infantrymen were so near that heavy weapons couldn't be used to dislodge the enemy. By mid-afternoon, forward movement had ceased. At 5 o'clock, following 15 minutes of heavy artillery shelling of Turkey Knob and the amphitheatre, another attack was mounted. It gained less than 200 yards, and General Cates ordered the lines secured for the night. Throughout the day, fighting had been intense and costly. But since shortly after the jump-off, Marines sensed a shift in Japanese tactics, as the 5th Division had found on the Western Front the previous day, noticeably less heavy artillery and mortar shelling, and more close-in small arms and machine gun fire. Cates realized his hope for closing down the meat grinder on D+13 hadn't materialized, and many more Marines would fall before the enemy bastion was silenced permanently. Nevertheless, the general was certain his 4th Division troops had finally penetrated Kuribayashi's main defense belt on the Eastern Front. From here forward, it would be a matter of exploiting the breach in enemy lines, taking out bypassed positions, and demolishing what remained of the strongpoints atop Turkey Knob and among the rubble of the amphitheatre and Minami village. Find a weak spot in the front and keep probing and slugging until you do, Cates had ordered. Marine casualties were grim evidence that no weak spot existed. 2,880 Marines had been killed or wounded. 3rd Division troops were alerted to begin their attack at 7:30 in the morning in the centre of the Cross Island front. But it was nearly noon before the 21st Regiment could move through the rain squalls. George Percy's hard-hit 2nd Battalion and Wendell Duplantis's decimated 3rd were the attack forces trying to slog through mud beyond Motoyama village and across the last high ground overlooking Iwo's northernmost beaches. Infantrymen were completely exhausted from day-after-day attacks, drenched and shivering from rain despite 75-degree temperatures. Resistance was heavy from concealed weapons, spewing small arms and machine gun fire. Visibility was less than 50 yards in any direction among the craggy ravines. Steam clouds hugged the ground in patches, and sulphur fumes gagged men whenever they took deep breaths. A bedraggled Fox Company sergeant said it was like a scene from a Frankenstein movie. Whenever winds cleared the front briefly, Marines moved ahead until pelted by more rain and pinned down by enemy fire. A 20-minute artillery barrage and naval gunfire from destroyers 500 yards off the north shore failed to spring the advance. At 5 o'clock, the word went out to hold your ground and dig in for the night. Percy's men had moved a scant 100 yards, and Duplantis's battalion had gained similar distance. Just before twilight, Marines were amazed to see a rainbow in the northeast as a brisk breeze pushed away sodden clouds, and Iwo was bathed in fading sunlight. General Erskine, watching the sunset from his command post, said that if they could get some rest and replacements and a day of good weather, they'd be able to wade in the ocean. Then maybe they could start thinking about getting off this goddamned island and turning it over to the army. 5th Division troops battled all day of D+13 among unnamed ravines and ridges northeast of Nishi. Terrain was more rugged and resistance more stubborn than that faced by the 3rd and 4th Divisions in their futile pushes in the centre and eastern end of the line, stretching 2.5 miles across the island. Because of poor visibility and proximity of enemy lines, neither artillery nor naval gunfire could support the attack. Tanks were stymied by minefields systematically laid in the narrow corridors of the contorted landscape, and Marines came under constant small arms and machine gun fire from dozens of hidden caves and pillboxes. Shermans could move only after armoured bulldozers had carved roadways for them to manoeuvre, and demolition squads had taken out bypassed strongpoints. This was a slow and laborious process, but any attempt by infantrymen to continue the advance before destruction of enemy positions resulted in excessive casualties. It was a typical Iwo-style struggle, where Japanese were rarely seen until they were dead. Occasionally the tanks flushed out enemy personnel who would be killed by the infantry, and this always raised the morale of the Marines. Although the division made only minor gains, the fighting was bitter and costly, and units were shifted from company to company, and often between battalions, to strengthen weakened outfits, most of which were fighting at half strength or less. Numbers told the story more forcefully. Colonel Chester Graham's 26th Regiment landed on D-Day with 3,256 officers and men. Since then, it had lost 50% of them, 1,644 killed or wounded. Colonel Thomas Warnham's 27th Marines had fared better, but not much. Its losses were 1,319, almost exactly 40%. Colonel Harry Liversedge's 28th had suffered worst of all, 1,952 casualties, nearly 60% of its landing force. Alarming and tragic as these numbers were, the cold mathematics didn't reflect the situation's seriousness or its impact on the Marine fighting machine's ability to continue the battle. Not only had 11 battalion commanders been killed or wounded since D-Day, but the loss of junior officers and senior non-commissioned officers at company, platoon and squad levels had been devastating, not to mention the thousands of seasoned, battle-tested troops who had fallen. More than 2,000 replacements, mostly second lieutenants new to combat and men fresh from the States, had been thrown into the struggle. Even when these men were well trained, which most often wasn't the case, they weren't yet members of the team. They had to be told and shown what to do to survive too often, not enough. General Kuribayashi now was powerless to control the battle's ebb and flow. He could only react to constant marine pressure. But Harry Schmidt, as 5th Corps commander with direct responsibility for winning the battle, notwithstanding the offshore presence of Holland Smith and Kelly Turner, was acutely aware that something must be done. Shortly before 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 weeks after D-Day, teletypes in the command posts of Erskine, Cates and Rocky clattered with orders. There will be no general attack tomorrow. Except for limited adjustment of positions, each division will utilize the day for rest, refitting, and reorganization in preparation for resumption of action on March 6th. In 14 days of battle and massacre unmatched in Leatherneck history, Marines now held a solid line stretching across Iwo Jima approximately where the invasion plan had expected it to be on the evening of D-Day +1. Sergeant William Gnaust, the motion picture cameraman who had filmed the second flag raising side by side with Joe Rosenthal, met his end on March 4th. He had spent most of the morning with Tom Pierce's battalion, Chandler Johnson's valiant outfit, in the bogged-down attack among the ridges and crevices overlooking the western shoreline on the 5th Division front. Because of low visibility and poor light, he had shot little footage, but he had been with the troops at the point of advance each time it was able to move, doubling as a rifleman and hoping conditions would improve enough to film some action. Just before noon, when a rain squall was at its heaviest, Gnaust and a comrade spotted the entrance of a bypassed cave. They approached it cautiously, entered its hidden mouth, and found themselves face to face with a squad of Japanese defenders. As the two surprised Marines turned to escape the death trap, they were cut down by small arms fire. Both died instantly, shot in the back in the fusillade before they could scamper to safety. Neither body was recovered. Within minutes, Marine demolition men flamed the entrance and sealed the cave for all time. Like most of the Marines who were first on the summit of Suribachi to raise the flags, Gnaust never learned of the impact on the home front of those epic moments in history. Gnaust's name remains unknown except to a handful of his comrades who remember the valor and dedication of a man who so wanted to be a Marine that he enlisted when he was 36, had been wounded at Saipan, had been recommended for the Navy Cross, had been awarded the Purple Heart and Bronze Star medals, and who died at 38 as a Marine sergeant upholding the traditions of the Corps. Daybreak of Monday, March 5th, D-Day +14. 2 miles behind the front, hard-working cooks and bakers had been at stoves and ovens most of the night, preparing hundreds of gallons of hot coffee, huge trays of fresh donuts and pastries, and enough sandwiches for nearly 15,000 Marines on the lines. Artillery and mortar fire from friend and foe fell across the island to signal the start of another day of battle, albeit one when there would be no Marine attack, as jeeps and trucks hauled their loads of chow to within a few hundred yards from where shells were dropping. A 3rd Division sergeant observed that it wasn't exactly what you would call room service at the Waldorf Astoria, but it sure beat cold sea rations. Regimental and battalion commanders had spent part of the past 12 hours merging shot-up units to bring them as near as possible to full strength for the renewed offensive. Replacements, confused and nervous, found their way to bivouac areas and were assigned to undermanned platoons and companies where they soon would face combat for the first time, and for a tragic number, the last. For some of the old-timers in grimy and ragged dungarees they had worn for 2 weeks, there were new uniforms. Runners scampered among command posts with mail from home. Ordnance men fitted new barrels to overworked machine guns. Riflemen, whose weapons were inaccurate and constantly misfiring from a combination of Iwo's sand, muck, and excessive use, were issued new M1 Garans and bars. Supplies of cartridges and hand grenades were replenished. corpsmen got fresh knapsacks of medical supplies. Bullet-pocked flamethrowers were patched up, and demolition squads assembled new satchel charges of explosives. Artillerymen cleaned and repaired their howitzers. Tank crews laboured on their Shermans tuning engines, fixing damaged treads, adjusting communications gear, and replacing worn-out cannon and machine guns. Back on Motoyama, No. 1, bulldozers and heavy tractors pulling giant earth rollers worked on the runway, interrupting activities frequently for an increasing stream of air traffic from the Marianas. Every half hour, from early morning until sunset, a hospital plane landed or took off. And the first of nearly 200 more Army P-51 Mustang fighters arrived to fly cover for B-29 missions over Japan and help out with close air support along the front. Wreckage still littered the beachhead in places, but now beached LSTs and other large landing craft had replaced Amtraks and Higgins boats in putting troops, equipment, and supplies ashore. A few men went swimming on the western beaches near the base of Suribachi. A mimeographed daily newspaper appeared for the first time, and copies were passed from man to man until the stapled 8-page Iwo Gazette came apart. Some men broke out galvanized buckets from the bottom of sea bags and scrubbed clothes. Volunteer barbers clipped the heads of buddies sitting on wooden ammunition boxes. A movie projector was set up in one hospital recovery tent where Marines awaiting evacuation viewed a Gary Cooper film, a selection of short subjects, and a recent newsreel highlighting the war in Europe. Shortly after 8:30 in the morning, Holland Smith was ashore for an inspection of frontline positions and a stormy session with Harry Schmidt and his division commanders. During the night, Schmidt and Erskine had made another urgent request to land the 3rd Regiment to provide new muscle for the final phase of the campaign, but again to no avail. General Erskine was silent throughout the meeting. He had already had his say in his personal confrontation with the old man. But Generals Rocky and Cates joined Schmidt in the verbal melee. All three were outspoken in their contention that 3,000 fresh men in the lines would bring the battle to a speedier end and save hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. But Holland Smith remained steadfast in his and Kelly Turner's position. There was not room enough on the island for another regiment to maneuver. Marines ashore could take the island, he said, and Admiral Turner would not release the regiment from floating reserve unless General Smith would certify that Iwo Jima could not be conquered without it. And this, Holland Smith refused to do. Weighing heavily on Smith's decision was a fact unknown to the other generals. Erskine's 3rd Division was scheduled to spearhead the invasion of Japan on Honshu Island, and Holland Smith wanted to make certain it had one regiment of combat veterans to lead the attack, an outfit that had not been shot to pieces on Iwo. Without a hint of this, the meeting broke up at 9 o'clock. Smith said to Erskine, "Let us go to the front, Bobby, and see what is happening." The long-time comrades in arms spent the rest of the day together, moving along the lines across the island from one command post to another. Several times they were forced to take cover when enemy mortars exploded yards away. Erskine remarked during one barrage that it was like old times. Holland Smith did not answer, but his eyes were misty as he nodded, smiled, and chomped hard on the omnipresent unlit cigar stub. It was the last time the two men would be side by side in combat. What the generals saw during their inspection of the front on Iwo's day of rest would have been considered a major dawn-to-dusk engagement in most other battles. While there was no attack as such, units of the 4th Division were still involved in the considerable task of containing and cleaning up resistance along the southern edge of the amphitheatre Turkey Knob complex. In the 3rd Division sector, artillery duels flared intermittently throughout the day as patrols from 4 battalions of the 9th and 21st Regiments demolished bypassed strongpoints north of the 3rd Airstrip and Motoyama village. Airstrikes and naval gunfire were called in several times to pound known and suspected Japanese artillery emplacements on and around Hill 362C, overlooking the route to the northern shoreline. Infantry action on the 5th Division front was restricted to straightening lines among the ravines and ridges along the west coast. There was little reaction from Japanese troops, but artillery and mortars terrified Marines resting in bivouac and those reducing bypassed bunkers and caves. 2 Shermans were disabled in supporting the mop-up operations, one by a landmine, the other by anti-tank fire. General Kuribayashi, whose headquarters now were believed by Marine intelligence officers to be in the area, must have been mystified and concerned by what the Leathernecks were doing, or not doing. but he kept up artillery and mortar fire from dawn until sunset, and his high-velocity anti-tank guns were especially active and effective in the afternoon. Shortly before 2:30 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel John Butler, commanding officer of the 27th Regiment's 1st Battalion, was in a jeep with 3 men moving slowly down a bumpy road, hardly more than a rock-strewn trail, inspecting the lines and mentally plotting what his outfit would do when the attack cranked up again the next morning. He told the driver to stop a minute as they approached a hardly visible intersection in the road, saying he wanted to take a better look at that ridge over there, pointing dead ahead at the ruins of Iwo's primitive sugar mill. The jeep had hardly come to a halt when an anti-tank shell decapitated Butler and wounded 2 other men. The tall, dark, intense, well-liked officer was the 12th Battalion commander to fall since D-Day, Lieutenant Colonel Justin G. Duryea, the regimental operations officer, took command of Butler's outfit. He was no stranger to the battalion. He had been its commanding officer at Camp Pendleton, back in California, and had trained it before the 5th Division shipped out for combat. Duryea would have his command 4 days. On March 9th, he was wounded by a landmine while moving forward with his men in the push toward Kitano Point. And so the day of rest came to an end. An hour before sundown, Erskine had gone to the beachhead at the East Boat Basin with General Smith. With firm handshakes and snappy salutes, the protégé and mentor parted company as Holland Smith, 4 officers, and 3 enlisted men, armed with Thompson machine guns, waded through the gentle surf to the open ramp of a Higgins boat for the 2-mile trip to the General's quarters on the Auburn. Missing from the armada that still surrounded Iwo was the cruiser Indianapolis, Admiral Spruance's flagship. During the afternoon, it had weighed anchor to speed Admiral Nimitz's man-on-the-spot back to Guam to mount the invasion of Okinawa. Gone, too, were the attack transports of the 3rd Regiment. Even as General Smith had held his meeting with the Iwo battle commanders earlier in the day, the 3,003rd Division troops were headed back to the Marianas for garrison duty and to start training for the invasion of Japan. Gone, too, were nearly 400 men of the 3rd, 4th and 5th Divisions. They had been killed or wounded during the day of rest. While General Kuribayashi may have found some initial solace in the absence of an all-out Marine ground attack on D+14, it is unlikely that it lasted for long. He was too shrewd, too much the complete professional soldier not to realize what the Americans were doing, and he certainly had to welcome the day of respite from constant attack on his own troops, who now were on a starvation diet of battle necessities, from food and water to medical supplies and ammunition. General Schmidt, stolid, methodical, pragmatic, now could see the battle's victorious end. How long it would take, and how many more Marines would fall, were still deeply troubling concerns to the laconic Nebraskan. But he was determined to finish the campaign as quickly as possible and with the fewest possible losses. To this end, he had spent most of the day planning the next phase of the push. There would be no basic change in strategy or tactics. The battle for Iwo Jima was being waged in the only possible way it could be fought, with infantry in head-on attack, position by position, until the last Japanese defender was wiped out or surrendered. But now that the beachhead was bulging with everything needed to win, with transports and fighters using Motoyama No. 1, with the treatment and evacuation of casualties a smoothly functioning machine, with the enemy being pushed to death with no hope of resupply or reinforcements, Schmidt was set to close the pincers. The process began at 7 in the morning of March 6th, D-Day +15, in thundering barrages of artillery, naval gunfire, and wave after wave of carrier planes, dropping clusters of napalm bombs as their machine guns and rockets ripped into enemy lines in low-level passes across the island. In tons of steel and explosives, the firepower approached that unleashed on D-Day in the final hour before Marines hit the beaches. Virtually every Marine howitzer on Iwo, 132, 75, and 155mm guns from 11 artillery battalions was in action. They first fired for 31 minutes on the western half of the island, and then rocked the eastern sector for the next 36 minutes. In 67 minutes, 22,500 shells slammed down along the front, often as close as 100 yards in front of the Marines waiting to jump off. From less than half a mile offshore, a battleship and 3 cruisers unloaded 450 rounds of 8 and 14-inch high explosives. 3 destroyers and 2 landing craft moved close in along the western shoreline to plaster the cliffs and caves with mortars and rockets. High explosives fell along the front every 10 seconds. It seemed impossible that any defense could withstand such a pounding. But Marines found differently when the infantry attack began shortly after 8 o'clock. Tom Warnham's 27th Regiment and Hartnell Wither's 21st moved out first at the western end of the line. Walt Wensinger's 23rd Marines and Walt Jordan's 24th Regiment were the attack troops on the eastern front. Japanese reaction was immediate and deadly across the island. Incredibly, the pulverizing pre-attack heavy shelling and airstrikes seemed not to have affected the enemy at all. As soon as the shells stopped falling and the carrier planes zoomed skyward and left the scene, the Japanese were alert and full of fight. It was apparent that all the blasting by artillery, naval gunfire, and planes had accomplished little to reduce the enemy's ability and will to resist. But a progressive diminution of enemy artillery had been noticed for several days. It was the mortar and automatic weapons fire that now made every yard of advance so costly. Patrick Cappelletti, a 25-year-old 5th Division corporal from New Brunswick, New Jersey, put it more succinctly. All the heavy shelling did was let the Japanese know we were coming at them again. It stirred them up like a hornet's nest, and they were waiting in their caves and bunkers to eliminate more Marines just as they had every day since we landed. At 5 in the morning, the 2nd Battalion of the 27th Regiment, Major John Antonelli's outfit, had taken positions in pre-dawn darkness to spearhead the attack. But even before the jump-off, a torrent of mortars laced Easy Company's staging area, claiming 35 casualties. Antonelli observed it was a big way to start the day, as corpsmen and stretcher-bearers went about their disheartening and dangerous jobs. Heavy machine gun and mortar fire, as well as snipers and landmines, stopped the 5th Division push before it was barely underway. Pillboxes and ever-present caves concealed in the jumble of ridges and crevices took their constant toll. Only after flamethrower tanks and demolition squads were able to incinerate strongpoints could minor gains be made, gains measured in meagre and vicious yards. Along the 3rd Division front, to the right of where the 5th was waging its futile day-long battle, the attack had some momentum, briefly. 2 platoons from George Company of the 21st Regiment's 2nd Battalion, commanded by a soft-spoken 23-year-old Lieutenant, William H. Mulvey, managed to claw to the crest of a ridge less than a quarter-mile from Iwo's northern coastline. Mulvey said later that there it was, they could see the shore, and it was an inspiring sight. But enemy small arms and mortar fire were so intense and accurate that the outfit could move neither forward nor backward. Mulvey sent Corporal Jerome J. Radke and another man for help to hold the precarious line. Radke made it back to the command post, where he quickly found a dozen volunteers, flamethrowers and demolition men, to move to the aid of their embattled buddies. He could have had twice that number. Within minutes, as they darted and ducked through a non-stop storm of bullets and mortars, 6 of the rescue squad were dead, and 2 others wounded in the vain attempt to bolster the outpost. For the remainder of the day, in the incredible jumble of rocks and broken ground in the sector where General Kurabayashi now had his headquarters, the Marines fought to survive. In this part of Iwo, the island literally gurgled with heat from underground volcanic fissures and crevices, making it all but impossible to dig foxholes because of blistering temperatures and sulfur fumes. Late in the afternoon, under cover of smoke grenades and an artillery barrage, Mulvey's battered survivors brought back their dead and wounded to positions beyond Motoyama village. Many men spent the night in foxholes they had used 2 days earlier. 3rd Division gains were negligible, from 50 to 200 yards. Casualties were not. 200 Marines, virtually a man for every yard of advance, had been killed or wounded. 2 battalions from Walt Wensinger's 23rd Regiment and 2 from Walt Jordan's 24th were the 4th Division's attack force on D+15. Spearhead companies immediately came under heavy mortar attack and machine gun and rifle fire in a pattern of mayhem that continued far into the night. It was an especially bad day for Easy Company of the 23rd Marines' 2nd Battalion. Its company commander and nearly a dozen men were wounded by mortars less than 15 minutes after the push began. Understandably, the attack sputtered and came to a halt after a gain of 50 yards. Late in the day, another mortar barrage hit the hapless company's command post. The new commanding officer, a 23-year-old lieutenant, was wounded, his executive officer killed, and 22 enlisted men were casualties. When the battalion intelligence officer took over the company, he became its 3rd commander in 12 hours and its 7th since D-Day. Major Doyle Stout's 3rd Battalion of the 24th was more fortunate, benefited by terrain where tanks could support the infantry. With 4 flamethrower Shermans at the point, the outfit moved 350 yards with moderate losses. Even with a day of rest, reorganization, replacements, and new weapons, the cumulative effects of 2 weeks of massacre and sheer physical toil cut deeply into the ability of the 4th Division to carry on the battle. That night, Colonel Edwin A. Pollock, the division's personnel officer, estimated the outfit's combat efficiency at 40%. The results of fatigue and lack of experienced leaders were very evident in the manner in which the units now fought. The same could have been said about the plight of the 3rd and 5th Divisions. Inescapable was the fact that all replacements on Iwo had been thrown into the battle. And with the 3rd Regiment's 3,000 men now steaming for Guam and already 200 miles at sea, no more trained troops were available. Rear echelon non-combatants, clerks, cooks, bakers, truck drivers, carpenters, mechanics, musicians, anyone who could carry a rifle, now must be used to fill the ranks of frontline units. Out on the Auburn, General Smith was aware of the situation, but there was nothing he could do about it. Years later, he would say he knew many of their best men had been lost, and that there was no way they could be replaced. So far, 2,777 Marines had been killed, another 8,051 had been wounded, and 1,102 were out of the battle because of combat fatigue. A total of 11,930 casualties. Little wonder that news stories were using Antietam and Gettysburg as historic yardsticks with which to compare what was happening at Iwo Jima, and while the end of the campaign might be in sight, it was far from over. Motoyama. Number 1 was taking on the look of a busy battle zone airfield in being. During the day, Brigadier General Ernest C. Moore flew in with more of the first echelon of the Army's 7th Fighter Command, 28 Mustangs, and a dozen Black Widow night fighters. 10 Marine Curtiss Commando transports landed with cargoes of mortar and artillery shells, plasma and whole blood, and 30 pouches of mail. Offshore, the Samaritan lifted anchor with its last complement of casualties and headed for Guam. Henceforth, most of the seriously wounded would be evacuated by air. Landings and departures were interrupted several times by artillery and mortar shelling that caused much excitement but little damage. Minutes after the fire lifted, another plane was touching down or lifting off. On Suribachi, Seabees laboured with bulldozers, jackhammers, dynamite, and earth movers to widen the road to the top of the volcano. When they finished, it would be a 2-lane route, 35 feet wide and nearly a mile long, with none of the inclines steeper than 10%. Richard Newcomb wrote that from now on, those too lazy to climb up could ride. Atop the crest now were radar, weather, and navigational equipment to aid B-29s and Mustangs in their strikes against the Japanese home islands. A few Japanese were still in Suribachi's labyrinth of tunnels and caves, but there was no fight left in them, Newcomb recalled. They came out only at night, searching for food and water. Every day there were fewer left. In his command post at the foot of the cliffs at the northern end of Motoyama No. 1, General Erskine called a meeting of his staff and combat commanders. The Big E had decided now was the time to spring the pre-dawn attack on the Japanese. What he had in mind was not a small-scale foray before an attack in force, but a major push made in darkness, a surprise thrust that he hoped would catch the Japanese asleep, or at least catnapping and off guard. Such a tactic had not been used on Iwo, and seldom had Marines employed it in earlier Pacific campaigns. It might work now, Erskine felt, as it had in France against the Germans in World War I. Maybe this could be the key to open the way for a breakthrough sweep, without heavy American casualties, that would carry to the island's northern shoreline. Lieutenant Colonel Howard J. Turton, the 3rd Division's dour and shrewd intelligence officer, was not keen on the idea for a number of reasons. He said it had its points, but it was too risky. They had already been shot to pieces, and they were at the bottom of the barrel of experienced people, officers, and men. Besides, he continued, the troops were not trained in the demanding skills of night fighting. The terrain was an open invitation to ambush. Heavy shelling had levelled so many landmarks that maps were next to impossible to decipher, and there was no assurance the enemy would not be alerted by the first movement of Marines, and be ready and waiting when they came. Captain Oscar Salgo, the 6'4" burly and gung-ho commander of the division's reconnaissance company, had some misgivings about the outcome of the venture. He told the general he didn't know what would happen, but they would do their best. You could be sure of that. Rain was beginning to fall as Erskine was on the field phone with General Schmidt for authority to attack at 5 o'clock instead of 7:30 as ordered. It did not take long for the 3rd Division commander to outline his scheme. Schmidt granted permission, and Erskine was in business. 2 companies from Colonel Boehm's 3rd Battalion of the 9th Marines began moving into the lines at 3:20 in the morning to spearhead the attack. The objective was Hill 362C, 250 yards to the southeast. Its capture would remove the last strongpoint between the Marines and Iwo's north shore. Company commanders tried to orient themselves in the light of parachute flares, but the steady downpour and black night practically obliterated the landscape. Radio silence was in force all along the line, and Marines moved as quietly as possible to launch the attack. At 4:50 in the morning, all illumination of the front stopped as ordered, but at 5 o'clock, an errant Navy Star shell, fired from a destroyer, burst over the lines. Apprehension swept Erskine's command post as the hushed, drenched troops froze in their tracks, fearful they would be dead before the attack began. But the brightly burning flare was almost immediately extinguished in the pelting squall. Once again, the front was in total darkness. 5 minutes later, Marine artillery fired a barrage of smoke shells to further screen the movement of the attackers, who began crawling forward again. They moved without detection for half an hour, until a Japanese machine gun opened fire and gave the alarm. The position was silenced in seconds by a flamethrower. Now the enemy was aroused, but not before Marines had passed through the lines without being discovered and without suffering a casualty. Dawn's light was cutting through the overcast, and the rain had stopped when Erskine began getting early reports. He beamed at Turton, the doubting intelligence officer, saying he had a hunch it would work. They caught them asleep just as he thought they would. Now radio silence was broken and circuits crackled with news, all of it good, or so it appeared. Attack troops still were meeting only scattered resistance, but the enemy was coming to life. Many Japanese had been terminated in their foxholes and pillboxes. Colonel Boehm reported that K Company was atop Hill 362C, but euphoria was brief. At about 6:30 in the morning, after a check of the terrain against maps and aerial photographs, Boehm found that the Marines were on Hill 331, not 362C. It was another 250 yards ahead. The explanation was simple. Given ideal conditions of terrain and weather, and with experienced troops and commanders, a night attack is warfare's most difficult maneuver. On Iwo, with its jumble of escarpments nearly the same elevation, it was difficult in broad daylight to distinguish one hill from another, to determine one ridge from the next. In the darkness and rain, the wrong objective had been pointed out and taken. Fortunately, the thrust was in the right direction. At 7:15, after 10 minutes of heavy artillery fire against Hill 362C, Marines resumed the attack. But by then, the Japanese were fully awake, and resistance was fierce. Not only were the attackers being hit from the front, but from positions bypassed in the silent sweep through the lines. It was late afternoon before 362C was finally in American hands. Boehm's outfit was not alone in slipping through scores of slumbering Japanese before being detected. Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Kushman's 2nd Battalion and Major William T. Glass's 1st gained several hundred yards before heavy fighting erupted around them at 7:30 in the morning. One instant everything was quiet, the next the attack was in an enemy ambush. From directly in front, and from bypassed bunkers and pillboxes only yards away, Marines were caught in a hailstorm of bullets and mortars. Within 5 minutes, the attack was not only pinned down, but both battalions were cut off from Marine lines. 2 of Cushman's companies, Easy and Fox, now were surrounded and in a roaring struggle for survival in an area that would quickly become known as Cushman's Pocket. Tanks and infantry from the 21st Regiment tried repeatedly throughout the day to extricate the embattled Marines, but without success. Fighting as fierce as any during the campaign would rage for 6 days in the narrow maze of ravines and ridges before the last Japanese gunner and his weapon was silenced. Baker Company's commander, 2nd Lieutenant John H. Limes, had serious doubts that he or any of his men would make it through the first day. The outfit from Glass's battalion had lost 23 killed and 20 wounded by mid-afternoon in holding its position 400 yards in front of the lines, and had lost contact with the rest of the bogged-down attack. Iwo was the first combat for the 22-year-old Chicagoan, but he had become battle-wise since D-Day and knew something drastic must be done if anyone in the company was to live. He told his platoon sergeant that if they spent the night here by themselves, they would all be wiped out. He was going for help. With that, the lieutenant sprang from behind the cover of a boulder and was spotted immediately by the Japanese. Sometimes crawling flat on the ground, other times ducking and darting in a scampering crouch, always under heavy fire from small arms and mortars, he zigzagged toward the rear. Later, he would say he knew that every time he moved, it could be the last, and that he would probably die out there. But what else could he do? He was a Marine. Fate was with the gallant Shavetail on his perilous 10-minute trip across no man's land to the command post. He made it unharmed. Minutes later, after showing Glass on an aerial photograph where the company was being systematically eliminated, Leames headed back to his men. It was twilight, and he was dragging a telephone line along to call in artillery and mortars to cover the withdrawal of the shot-to-pieces outfit. He worked his way across the same terrain, was caught again in a crackling fusillade of enemy fire, and was amazed and grateful to be still alive and unwounded after dashing the last 50 yards like an upright Olympic runner to reach the outpost. He jumped into a foxhole, occupied by 2 startled Marines, and said in a voice loud enough to carry over the noise of a falling mortar barrage to pass the word, "Be ready to take our wounded and pull back to the lines when he gave the signal." Still gasping for breath, he was immediately on the field phone he had brought with him. He told Glass he would give him map coordinates of where to deliver artillery and mortars so they could get out of there. Shells were screaming through the gathering darkness 5 minutes later, their roaring explosions driving the Japanese to cover as the Marines began their desperate trip to the safety of the lines. Some carried wounded comrades on their backs, and it was nearly 10 o'clock at night before the pullback was completed without further casualties. But Baker Company was on the brink of extinction, bled white and all but wiped out in 19 agonizing hours since the pre-dawn attack began. Fewer than 24 men came back unhurt. To make matters worse, Leames found that several wounded had been left behind in no man's land, missed in the black night during the confusion of the pullout. With no thought except to do what he knew must be done, Leames crawled alone through the darkness and dragged 1 Marine back. Then he went out again and brought in another. The next day he would say they were his men, his comrades, and they would have been out there, come hell or high water, bringing him in if the situation was reversed. Baker Company's commander would be wounded before Iwo was captured and would receive 2 medals for his part in the island's conquest, the Purple Heart and the Medal of Honor. Kushman's Pocket was a dusk-to-dawn, nightmarish battle for survival for Easy and Fox companies, surrounded by fiercely resisting Japanese entrenched in a complex of caves, pillboxes, trenches, and dug-in tanks. First Lieutenant Wilcie A. O'Bannon was fearful that his Company F would cease to exist by daybreak. Captain Maynard Schmidt was no more optimistic about the prospects for his men in Company E. Both units had been isolated and unable to move in any direction since mid-morning. O'Bannon with 41 troops and Schmidt with 44. Tanks tried twice to extricate them, both times without success. The first attempt failed when the lead Sherman triggered a roaring chain of explosions when it hit a landmine, lost its treads, and blocked the narrow ravine that was the hoped-for escape route. Boulder-strewn terrain and intense fire from anti-tank guns stopped the second rescue mission. Without hope of immediate help, Easy and Fox companies did the only thing possible. They dug in and fought for their lives. O'Bannon recalled when he and 19 survivors finally made it to safety after 36 hours in the death trap, that they were in one big mess, and they knew it. Schmidt got back to the lines with 9 men. Japanese positions were so near on all sides that the enemy taunted the Marines when they were not being cut down. O'Bannon remembered they couldn't see anything from their foxholes, and sticking your head up meant losing it. From the Japanese came intermittent shouts. "Hey, stupid Marine, tonight you die. Banzai, charge." O'Bannon was glad there had been no attack. It would have been curtains for them, he said. Except for Cushman's Pocket, where the Japanese were in firm control, March 7th had been a gratifying day for the 3rd Division. General Erskine's gamble on the pre-dawn attack had paid off despite heavy losses to the 9th Regiment, the near debacle of taking the wrong hill in the darkness, and having to swarm 362C in broad daylight. Colonel Boehm noted in his battle journal that although nearly all the basic dope was bad, the strategy proved very sound, since it turned out that the open ground taken under cover of darkness was the most heavily fortified of all terrain captured. Marines had paid a high price for Hill 362C, nearly 600 men killed or wounded. But now nothing could drive them from its crest, and its capture had removed the last major obstacle blocking the final breakthrough to Iwo's northern shoreline in the center of the island. Erskine said that from now on, it was all downhill, and the end, thank God, was in sight. If anyone on Iwo was the epitome of a professional fighting man, it was one of the general's men, Sergeant Reed Carlos Chamberlain. He had joined the Corps in the late 1930s and was a swashbuckling 22-year-old corporal serving in the Philippines when Pearl Harbor was attacked. For 5 months his outfit fought side by side with outnumbered and outgunned American soldiers and sailors, and a small and ill-trained Filipino army, before being smothered by a 1-million-man Japanese invasion force. Chamberlain was on Corregidor, wounded and plagued with malaria, when the island fortress in Manila Bay fell to General Masaharu Homa's troops on May 7, 1942. In the wild confusion of the final shots and surrender, he managed to evade the conquering Japanese, found a leaky boat, and escaped with 3 men to Mindanao Island, where they somehow located a band of American and Filipino guerrillas who nursed him back to health. During the next 15 months, Chamberlain fought in, and then led, countless hit-and-run raids against the Japanese. Word of the corporal's leadership and daring reached General MacArthur in Australia, who commissioned him a second lieutenant in the United States Army. American submarines by mid-1943 were making regular runs to supply the guerrillas with ammunition and medicine and to collect first-hand intelligence. MacArthur ordered one of the missions to bring Chamberlain back to Allied Southwest Pacific headquarters at Melbourne, where he was promoted to first lieutenant, awarded the Army's Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism, and sent by air back to the States for a hero's welcome and to sell war bonds. Like Manila John Basilone, this was not Reed Chamberlain's version of what a professional fighting man should be doing in wartime. He resigned the commission, rejoined the Marine Corps, traded his officers' bars, and all that went with them for the stripes of a leatherneck sergeant, and asked for combat duty. An obliging but confused personnel officer sent him to the 3rd Division in time for the Iwo campaign. Now, in the late afternoon of D+16, Sergeant Chamberlain and several men were making their way to the front from the 9th Regiment's command post. As a battalion runner, he had made the trip several times during the day, each time using his combat skills to evade snipers who had been especially troublesome. Alvin Josephy, the Marine correspondent, was among the group. He and the others believed that the area had been cleared of Japanese, although mortars still fell with uncomfortable frequency. Josephy wrote that they were picking their way among the stones when 3 shots rang out from the hillside. Startled, Marines scrambled for cover behind boulders. Chamberlain snapped his Colt pistol from its holster, looking for the source of the enemy fire. There was another shot, Josephy recalled. They heard a thud. They thought the bullet had struck the curving side of the ridge. Suddenly there was bedlam as Marines sprayed the area, still unable to spot the sniper's nest. Josephy said they called Chamberlain but received no answer. Other men joined the fray, emptying their clips in a fury of futility. One burly sergeant stood straight up without a helmet on and fired his carbine from the hip, moving directly at a hole as he fired. The ambulance driver found Chamberlain slumped against a rock. His eyes were open, but he was dead. The thud the Marines had heard was the bullet that took his life. It remained for Josephy to write Chamberlain's epitaph. With minor variations, the same words could have been used for thousands of others who died on Iwo. There is nothing you can say or do when a good friend is suddenly martyred in battle. You feel stunned, angry, sad, and frustrated. We could have fired point blank the rest of the day at those holes. The Japanese would only have laughed at us. In an instant they had claimed one of our best men. Chamberlain's wonderful war record had ended abruptly. After so many heroic deeds, it seemed an added tragedy that he lost his life while doing nothing but walking. There was nothing anybody could do about it. Business as usual was the pattern of D+16 along the 5th Division's front. Colonel Graham's 26th Regiment moved out at daybreak without artillery support, not as a tactic to surprise the enemy, but because Marine howitzers were short of shells from the previous day's heavy shelling. But the Japanese were caught off guard by the absence of pre-jump-off shelling, and the advance quickly made nearly 200 yards, overrunning a defensive complex on a hill that had held up the previous day's advance. Some Marines rested while others proceeded to surround the knoll, north of the rubble of Nishi village. For the most part, things were quiet. only the occasional hiss of a flamethrower's jet stream of fire and the explosion of a satchel charge as demolition men sealed bypassed cave entrances. In fact, things were too quiet to suit suspicious old-timers. One man atop the ridge thought he detected the muffled sounds of hand grenades exploding beneath him. Suddenly there was a gigantic blast that could be heard on Motoyama No. 1 and on the summit of Suribachi. A flash of flame shot into the air, followed by a series of rumbles and a chain of more explosions. The hill shuddered for an instant before its top blew sky high. Dozens of men were swallowed in the mammoth crater. Others were blown into the air like rag dolls, stunned by concussion and wounded by cascading rocks and chunks of concrete. Marines on the slopes scrambled to the top and frantically began digging out comrades. One Marine struggling down the slope saw Japanese trying to escape from caves, only to be buried in landslides that sealed up most of the holes in the ridge's sides. What the enemy had done would happen repeatedly during the final phase of the battle. They had blown up their own command post, killing and wounding scores of Marines at the same time, in this instance claiming nearly 100 26th Regiment casualties. Colonel Liversedge's 28th Marines had easier going in their push along the western shoreline. They jumped off at 9:05 in the morning against light resistance that caused them less difficulty than the terrain. With gunfire from destroyers paving the way, the attack had little trouble moving 500 yards toward Kitano Point. There were several anxious minutes just before sundown, a poison gas alarm that lasted less than a quarter hour before it was discovered. The alert was caused by a strong breeze, blowing sulfur fumes, and the smell of a smouldering enemy ammunition dump that had been hit by Marine artillery. But the advance was not without cost. Sniper fire, hand grenades, and mortars took their toll. All things considered, however, it was one of the best days the 28th had experienced since the flag raising on Suribachi. Japanese infiltrators were active along the 4th Division front in the post-midnight hours of D+16, making repeated small-scale attempts to find a weak spot in the lines. Captain Headley's battalion was the target of the first raid, but the intruders were spotted and wiped out before they reached Marine positions. Major Mee's battalion was hit by the next foray, a probing action that began in silence and then erupted into a 2-hour firefight before it was over and the enemy destroyed. Point-blank rifle and grenade duels flared along the 200-yard front, a frantic battleground lighted by star shells falling among the ridges and gullies. Some of the 50-man Japanese force were able to sneak around outposts and jump into Marine foxholes before being discovered, only to die in man-to-man combat fought with bayonets, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, even rifle butts and rocks. A dozen Japanese, hugging the sides of one ravine, were spotted in the glare of a parachute flare and instantly killed by rifle and machine gun fire. When dawn came, Mee's men counted 50 lifeless Japanese in and around the Marine positions, but 13 Marines also had been killed in the furious melee. A bitter platoon sergeant said it was too much to pay, even if they would have terminated a company of the Japanese. Dry canteens were found on many of the riddled enemy, a sign that the Japanese were not only bent on taking the lives of Marines but also trying to find water. Others carried no ammunition to reload empty rifles. The only weapons of 2 infiltrators were anti-personnel mines strapped around their waists, self-destructive devices they had been unable to use. Elsewhere along the line were minor scrimmages, frequent and heated exchanges of close-in rifle and grenade fire that kept weary Marines awake and alert. Then, at 5:02 in the morning, a large Japanese rocket made a direct hit on the command post of the 23rd Regiment's 2nd Battalion. It was one of the few instances during the battle that one of these missiles found its target, this time with devastating results. Killed in the blast was the outfit's communications chief. Every other man in the command post was wounded. Major Robert H. Davidson, the outfit's commanding officer, his executive officer, Major John J. Padley, Captain Edward J. Schofield, the operations officer, the battalion adjutant, and 2 sergeant clerks. Lieutenant Colonel Edward J. Dillon, the regimental executive officer, took over from Davidson, stunned by concussion but otherwise unhurt. He was back on the front 4 days later and would lead the battalion for the rest of the campaign. But the battle was over for the others, evacuated to hospitals in the Marianas. When the 4th Division attack began at 7:30 in the morning, it found the Japanese somewhat subdued the usual enemy rifle and machine gun fire, the hand grenades and mortars, the sniper bullets pinging into advancing troops. The Japanese firepower around Turkey Knob had been notably reduced. Gains for the day were unimpressive along the front, but casualties were relatively light as the Marines fought to drive to Iwo's eastern shoreline. It was now only a matter of time until the Savage sector no longer was an obstacle to the capture of the island. Only a matter of time and more casualties until Marines no longer would be wounded or die in overwhelming strongpoints. Among the cliffs above the East Boat Basin, the monks of Makalapa had expected would be taken on D-Day.